Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Wednesday, June 28th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Michael German, former FBI agent who infiltrated white supremacist groups. He'll be with us to discuss why those groups target non-white people in their ranks. And later in the program, Matt Ford of the New Republic will catch us up on this deluge of Supreme Court decisions as their term ends. Meanwhile, SCOTUS imposes limits on laws that criminalize threats on the internet. First Amendment maximalist decision, you could say. In Mallory v. Norfolk Southern, SCOTUS also upholds a Pennsylvania law requiring corporations to be sued in the state if they do business there. Trump says the audio of him saying that he had not declassified the documents that he took was just bravado. You know me, it's just bravado. Another way of saying he was lying, but I don't think this time he was.
Snowden should have used that.
Right. Yeah.
It was all just bravado. I don't know anything about that, actually.
Now he's countersuing E. Jean Carroll for defamation, classy as always. Rudy Giuliani interviewed in the special counsel's election interference investigation. Ooh. Kevin McCarthy in hot water with the MAGA cult after questioning whether Trump was the strongest candidate against Biden. Whoopsie.
I mean, he is.
Yeah. Totally. U.S. Intel says a senior Russian general knew of Prigozhin's mutiny plans, and that he may have thought he has internal military support. Israel approves thousands of new illegal settlements in the West Bank. More wildfires in Canada. Air quality in the Midwest and Chicago at dangerous levels. Thousands of nurses in Texas and Kansas walked out and striked yesterday. Massive study analyzing decades of health data in Denmark shows trans people have a 7.7 times higher suicide attempt rate. In better news, Maine's legislature advances a bill protecting gender-affirming care for trans kids. Yusef Salaam, a member of the exonerated Central Park Five, set to win a city council seat in Harlem. And lastly, U.S. pedestrian deaths are at their highest in 41 years, according to a new analysis. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, everybody. It's the Majority Report. It is also Hump Day. How are you? How is everybody doing? Sam is out for the rest of the week. His road trip with the kids should have just started. So I will be with you for the rest of this week.
As of now, we're calling it interim.
Yes, as of now. I mean, let's
watch his space.
Yeah, I mean, please don't make alert Sam to anything. Is all I'm trying to say. All right, we're doing this very, very subtly. It's a soft coup, potentially. Let's get right into it because I mentioned in headlines that the Supreme Court is in the middle of essentially dumping all of its decisions at the end of June before their term ends. So we're going to be seeing a lot of important decisions coming down that we haven't even seen yet. We have the affirmative action case coming up. We have the student debt cancellation case coming up, which I'm pessimistic about, even though the standing for the plaintiffs in that case is a complete joke. We have the version of the gay wedding cake case, this time with a graphic designer that's also going to be ruled on. But the first big domino to fall did fall yesterday, and that was Moore v. Harper. This was a win in aggregate for people who are in favor of democracy. There are some pessimistic takes, some optimistic takes, but the worst case scenario was avoided because the Supreme Court essentially rejected the independent state legislature theory, which was an extremist right-wing conception of how elections should be managed at the state level, essentially saying that state legislatures should be able to gerrymander, write election laws, ban mail-in ballots, do whatever the hell they wanted, but without any recourse, like without the input of other legislative bodies or other like state courts and the governor. It was essentially saying, no, this is just the state legislatures that can make these determinations. So
the thing
it was
the
an anti-checks and balances argument, right? And what the court essentially ruled was that, no, we're going to have federal courts have jurisdiction over this and they can be a check on this. And some people are saying that's a good thing. Others are saying, well, hold on, look what happened in Bush v. Gore. This is the Supreme Court giving itself more power. But the long and the short of it is, yes, this extremist right-wing effort has been done away with for now. So the worst case scenario has been avoided. But Laura Ingraham is not too happy about this decision. Here she is on her show, recently demoted, by the way. I think she's probably aged out for the Murdoch crew, because now it's going to be Jesse Waters at 8 p.m. Hannity hangs on to 9 p.m. and Gutfeld has supplanted her as one of the other three primetime hosts. So she's having this conservative activist, Carrie Severino, on, and they're pretty bummed out about this ruling.
Right now, the Supreme Court is dominated by 6 very conservative justices. They've begun to make very, very radical, extreme, and activist rulings.
The Supreme Court has lost the confidence of a great portion of the American public.
An institution that has been scandal-free for most of its life and has now been corrupted by the dark money influences.
What? All right. There's some that are saying that this constant drumbeat of criticism and of protests at people's houses, that's gotten to the newest Republican appointees on the court. Well, the conservative court has leveled a series of rulings that to some look like an attempt to maybe insulate them from external criticism, or is that too, pedestrian of an analysis? Well, just today, the Supreme Court ruled against the North Carolina GOP state legislature in an election law dispute. Here now is Carrie Severino, president of the Judicial Crisis Network. Carrie, look, it's disappointing for those of us who, rarely disagree with Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch on an issue such as this, that Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh would vote with the Democrat appointees. What's your take here?
I think it's no surprise here. Justice Thomas clearly had the best argument of the day. He recognized the case that they were deciding was actually completely moot. They shouldn't have even had a decision, and yet they kind of went out of their way to
decide this case.
To decide the case. I think that was the wrong route, and it's frustrating. It's particularly frustrating when you see the Chief Justice and Kavanaugh, not just in this case, but in others, doing things that look really political. That said, I think at the end of the day, even today's case was a lot better than it's being played. I think a lot of people on the left want to do a victory dance.
It's a defeat for Trump.
But
they have to tie it to Trump.
Right. They said there was this fringe independent state legislature theory. Actually, it turns out the fringe theory is the idea that the state Supreme Courts can do whatever they want. Actually, the court all agreed that there have to be some limits. Again, I don't think they should have even agreed on that. They shouldn't have heard this case in the first place because North Carolina had already resolved it.
That's hilarious. This was a ruling on the broad usage of the independent state legislature theory. So now, essentially, this undercuts any other state's attempts to do so. The reason people are tying it to Trump is because Trump tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And the reason the Supreme Court was hearing this case is because this was an attempt to codify those efforts into law, which would make it much easier on the state level for democratic election results to be overturned. Because we know this. I mean, luckily there's been a bit of a backlash where, you know, the Pennsylvania state legislature has tried to attack the election laws in their own way, and that hasn't worked out for them. But for the most part, there were a bunch of extremists on the state level, on the Republican side, who, if this independent state legislature theory actually came to pass, they might have been successful in a variety of states of just throwing out a bunch of ballots and saying, hey, it was Trump. We declare these ballots invalid, and we've decided that we're going to just call it for Trump. That's why it's being tied to him. At the very least, what this would have done is allow these state legislatures to impose incredibly draconian restrictions on the ability of elections to be held. Mail-in ballots could have been nullified. Early voting could have been nullified. They could have done whatever they wanted in terms of polling locations.
Yeah, they weren't going to do more to help people vote. Like, that's the thing. Like, we can all this. It's frankly academic. This independent state legislature theory. They want the right to not take votes, to not count votes, to throw votes out, or to overturn votes.
Yeah, right.
And that's simply the right that they're fighting for. And to go back to Ingram's premise, I agree with it, that they do act in ways that are basically political and to insulate themselves from public censure, and that's why we shouldn't have a Supreme Court. But this whole, like, the actual fundamental issue here is because these state legislatures want to overturn the results of elections.
Right, and the reason too that they say it's not as bad as it's being portrayed by people on the right, and that the left's win is maybe a little bit premature, is for the reason I cited earlier, that the Supreme Court really did give itself more power. It codified, or at least set a precedent for the future for their ability to weigh in on these kinds of electoral disputes, in addition to obviously what they ruled in Bush v. Gore.
And again, like, to me, that should be the Congress's job. I do not trust the Supreme Court to be in charge of getting rid of gerrymandering and civil rights.
Yes, exactly.
For the next 50 years.
Yeah. And so that's why that's the silver lining for the anti-democracy right. But we'll be talking more about that with Matt Ford in a bit. Right now, we have a word from one of our sponsors. Sam, take it away.
Also, this episode brought to you by Zippix Nicotine Toothpicks. Zippix makes it much easier for you to stop filling your lungs with smoke or with vape. You can get your nicotine fix anytime, anywhere, without having to rely on those nasty cigarettes, or those, God knows what's in those vape things. Zippix Toothpicks gives you an easier and a healthier and more discreet way to get your fix. They're available in 6 flavors. They have options in 2 milligram and 3 milligram of nicotine. They're perfect for flights, for sporting events, restaurants, literally anywhere, everywhere else that smoking and vape are banned. And it's a great way to start to get rid of your cigarettes, get rid of your vape, and replace them with something that's also going to provide you a relief for your oral fixation. I know, that's the way I stopped smoking. And now these are the ones that I use. Zippix also offers caffeine and B12 infused toothpicks. They got a couple of different flavors. This one's the cinnamon and spearmint. And this is a great bridge off of your nicotine habit. Zippix has already helped tens of thousands of customers leading a healthier lifestyle. If you currently smoke or vape, they can probably help you too. Make your lungs happy. Make anybody around you who has a nose happy. Make your, God knows what other organs are under pressure because you're vaping. Try Zippix Nicotine Toothpicks today. Ditch the cigarettes, ditch the vape, get some nicotine-infused toothpicks at zippixtoothpicks.com. and get 10% off your first order by using the code majority at checkout. Your lungs are going to be glad you did. Just a disclaimer, the product contains nicotine, which is an addictive chemical, and you must be 21 or older to order. Zip more, smoke less with Zippix nicotine toothpicks.
We are back, and we are joined now by Mike German, who is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program, author of Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Democracy. And Mike, you're working on a new book about white supremacist violence, and that's going to be published next year, it seems. Mike, thanks so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you're a former FBI agent. You infiltrated white supremacist groups in the 1990s. And I'm just curious about your experience with that. Obviously, scary work. But how would you say your work, from your perspective, fits into the Bureau's broader history of racism, like in terms of targeting civil rights activists, and frankly, that's ongoing, honestly, with Black Lives Matter as well. What is your perspective on how your work fits into that larger picture analysis?
So it actually, I think, was reflective of what was going on and still going on. People assume that because the case was successful, that it was supported right from the very beginning. But that actually wasn't true. It was really only in both of my undercover cases targeting the white supremacists and far-right groups, there was a lot of resistance in management and at headquarters to those cases, and it was only because there were really very effective case agents who did the work to gather the evidence and had the administrative skills to get over every obstacle that those cases were actually approved. And frankly, it was made more dangerous because there were a lot of administrative obstacles that were being thrown in front of us that we had to overcome as I'm working directly with these dangerous individuals. So we were successful, and if you look through the history of the FBI, you'll find cases where similarly effective agents were able to go out and make cases. Even today, there are some good cases you could point to, the investigations against a white supremacist group called the Base, where the FBI can be effective. They have the tools, but it's just not prioritized. So if somebody wants to investigate environmentalists, they don't need to have a lot of evidence suggesting that there's some crime going on. They're given a green light and, in fact, given a national scope in their investigation, where, even in our investigations, even after they became successful and we worked our way into the people who were trafficking in illegal arms, we were constantly being told, stick to your region, the jurisdiction of the field office,
and is your
failing to recognize
go on,
that these are national groups. That these groups operate on a national and even international basis. So working them like a local police department would isn't the most effective methodology.
Yeah, and I am curious too, like you must have seen what some of your colleagues were able to do when they were, doing work that wasn't combating white supremacy. Like, were you surprised, or was the contrast in the resources and the support that you were given incredibly stark when you looked at the work that other people in your field were doing?
Definitely. And, the first case that I worked in 1992 targeting neo-Nazi skinhead groups in Los Angeles, it was my first undercover operation. So I didn't really know what to expect, and therefore wasn't terribly surprised by bureaucratic obstacles. As everybody in the FBI used to say, bureaucracy is our middle name. and all cases have those problems, but it was really only in talking to other undercover agents, particularly agents working drugs, where there was just flush with money and authorities, and nobody blinked at traveling around the world I recognized it was contrast, but I figured as a program, the domestic terrorism program was learning how to do an operation like that. So it was expected that they would be a little cautious in how they went about it and miserly with using resources to avoid criticism. But then when I continued working undercover cases and continued to see the same kind of bureaucratic resistance, I recognized that this was a deeper problem.
And is that really what motivated you to leave the FBI and speak about this more publicly?
So it really came down to a case, a post 9/11 case, where, again, when 9/11 happened, we all recognized the horror of it, but I was hopeful that the silver lining would be that there would be recognition that the counterterrorism program is mismanaged and needs to be revamped and headed in a completely different direction. But instead, what the FBI management decided to do is pretend it was a matter of limits on their intelligence collection, so taking those limits off. But if the problem is mismanagement of information and misunderstanding of information, having more information doesn't solve that problem. It makes it worse. And I became involved in a case that actually involved international terrorists and reaching out to white supremacist terrorists here in the United States, seeking to get some support from them. And the case, like my other two cases, was seriously mismanaged in the initiation. And at the time, the director, Robert Mueller, after some criticism of the FBI's handling of the 9/11 intelligence, said, well, if there's any agents out there that see a counterterrorism case being mismanaged, call headquarters. So I did. They didn't really want you to call headquarters.
Right.
And I was told I would never work undercover again, and then kind of put on the shelf, and realized after 2 years of trying to turn it around that my ability to work on effective cases at the FBI had ended, and it was time for me to find another way to talk about these issues.
I mean, that's well, we're grateful, because then we get to talk to you and pick your brain about some of the things that we don't see behind the scenes, but we only read about, obviously. And your personal account is super consistent with what we've heard and seen in terms of resource allocation within the FBI. I guess now let's talk a bit more about your undercover work and your work with white supremacists. You were interviewed in for Brennan, and I read that interview about your experience seeing white supremacist groups recruit non-white people, particularly the focus was Latino white supremacists, because right now, Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys was a Cuban American. Nick Fuentes is an open Nazi. Even the neo-Nazi shooter in Texas was of Hispanic descent, and I think that a lot of people feel that that's an incompatible perspective, but
inconsistency.
But in fact, it's clearly a concerted effort by the groups in order to launder their agenda. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, and I think it's really important to recognize, as they do, that race is a social construct, and who is considered white can vary over time. And particularly with Hispanics, a lot of the white supremacist ideology suggests that it's an ancestry in Western Europe that makes you white. And so many Hispanics have ancestral connections back to Spain. So if somebody had a Spanish surname, they could just say, "Oh, I'm not Latin American.
Right.
My ancestry traces back to Spain, which is in Europe, which makes me white." and there really wasn't a lot of investigation. If somebody claimed that, okay, you're in. And obviously, as white supremacy and far-right militancy merge, there are far-right governments all over the world, and there are ethno-nationalist groups all over the world that have different races and are focusing on a different ethnicity that are like-minded with white supremacists, so tend to work in concert with them. But and also human nature is just odd. Sometimes people identify with a group that outwardly hates them, and because race is a social construct, sometimes it's just trying to associate with power. So if white people are the group in power in a particular country, and I'm not white, I might want to assist them just for the short-term protection that gives me, hoping that things will change before the race war starts that they're trying to start. So there have always been people with Jewish backgrounds, people with multiracial backgrounds who've been part of these movements.
Yeah, and I think people think of the Chappelle skit of Clayton Bigsby, right, of the black white supremacist, but it really is obviously more complex than that. Would you say it's this desire to be close to a sense of power that draws from their end people into it? I mean, based on your undercover work, what did you see was really the hook for non-white people to be associated with something like this?
Well, really the hook for all of them, for the groups that I was infiltrating, the part of the white supremacist movement that was openly participating in criminality and violence, a lot of them were just criminals.
Right.
And, there aren't too many, if you try to join some local social club and tell them about your love of bomb making, you're probably not going to be very popular. But if you find this group, you'll be very popular, and they'll let help you expand your interest in bomb making. So there were a lot of people who really weren't that interested in reading Mein Kampf, but were interested in committing violence, and that's what attracted them to the movement. So, like any other group, you wouldn't expect some 19 or 20-year-old Marine to understand the geopolitics of whatever invasion or police action that they're involved in. They're more mission-oriented, and if when one of my cases, tracing who were engaging in illegal weapons trafficking, they took me to Asian arms dealers, and they wouldn't say, "Oh, well, that violates my ideological goals to actively engage with other racial groups." That's not how it works. They have guns. We want guns. We're going to get them.
Right. I mean, and how does this recruitment effort fit into broader, the branding of these groups? Because what's the group that advertised itself as a drinking club? Is it the Proud Boys?
Oh, right, the Proud Boys.
It's the Proud Boys. Yeah.
Right, and a lot of groups, particularly the far-right militias, try to have a more palatable public positioning. So they'll claim not to be white supremacists, and the Proud Boys were very much practiced in that and called themselves instead Western chauvinists, which is kind of just a semantic trick, right? They're talking about the supremacy of Western Europe, which is white. Obviously they could point to individual members who might not fit the public perception of who is white, but their activity was hand in glove with other white supremacist groups when they were committing crimes. So it was a distinction without a difference. And there have always been groups like that. And, particularly as the far right movement has received more public attention and is trying to expand its reach. One of the popular T-shirts is Pinochet did nothing wrong. Embracing South American fascism and ethno-nationalism that helps them find partners in their efforts to move their agenda forward.
I mean, and it fits very nicely, unfortunately, with the global fascism effort that we're seeing, whether it be Bolsonaro in Brazil, whether it be Erdogan in Turkey, whether it be what's the guy of Hungary? Orban in Hungary. There is a message discipline, but with those governments, and you'll hear the same. You heard the same stuff that Trump was saying coming out of Bolsonaro's mouth, essentially, and like Tucker Carlson's going to Hungary to do these interviews, and the internationalism is also a part of, I would imagine, the strategy of this.
Exactly, and always has been, right? If you go back to the original Nazis, and it always frustrates me when you hear FBI management talk about white supremacy as domestic violent extremism because it's a domestic ideology. We didn't invent Nazis.
Yeah,
right? It's always been an international ideology and international in action as well. And the original Nazi Germany was allied with the Axis power, which included Japan, and had positive relationships with some Arab countries. So it's a misinterpretation of both history and their ideology that would make somebody believe that this is a problem that is domestic in nature. It only occurs in the United States. And it's fascinating when I mentioned the base cases. One of the individuals arrested was a Canadian military deserter who had come across the border to participate in the plot, and an FBI official identified him as an example of international domestic terrorism, which kind of shows how it's a very confused lexicon.
Yeah, it should be contradictory, but it's just like, I mean, lastly here, you talked about in your interview how this effort to brand themselves and have non-white people in their ranks, this is a part of their, I think, public-facing brand, but also a way for them to skirt under some classifications made by federal law enforcement when it comes to domestic terrorism and white supremacist violence. Can you flesh that out a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. And just quickly, as the Latino population of the United States grows, the distribution of power will change, and who will be considered white will expand. And of course, there are already many ethnicity or Hispanic is an ethnicity, not a race, and there are white Hispanics and black Hispanics and Asian Hispanics. But who the movement considers white will expand as well to incorporate them, because they need numbers and they need supporters. So they will recruit in communities that are achieving more equity in the society. Because I think the law enforcement agencies still misunderstand how the ideology works in practice with the white supremacists, the violent white supremacists and far-right militants. It's easy for them to mistake what is happening and overlook somebody because they don't fit their idea of what these groups do rather than the reality of what they do.
Mike German, fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. You can pick up his book, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide: How the New FBI Damages Democracy, and be on the lookout for his next book coming next year. Thanks so much, Mike, for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will be joined by Matt Ford. Sorry about that, guys. Just a bit of connectivity issues today, but now we are joined by Matt Ford of the New Republic here to talk about a very busy week in the Supreme Court world. Matt, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with Moore v. Harper, the independent state legislature case. I have read different analyses of this decision, ranging from pessimistic to optimistic. It seems that the pessimism is centered around the fact that the decision essentially empowers federal courts as opposed to doing something more broadly to protect election integrity. What's your take on how this decision was framed?
Well, it really depends on whether you're a pessimist or an optimist. If you're an optimist, you read the decision and you see that the court rejected quite decisively the independent state legislature doctrine, which is something that is a fringe theory on when state courts can review election laws for federal elections passed by state legislatures. If you're an optimist, you see that they've rejected that theory and removed a potential threat to the stability of the 2024 elections. If you're a pessimist, though, you see the little trailer that Chief Justice Roberts snuck in at the end there, where he suggested that, even as we're saying that state courts can decide these cases, we're also carving out a role for ourselves. Now, if you're a pessimist, you might be more inclined to think that that could lead to certain other forms of mischief down the road.
Right, and we've kind of seen some mischief, though, from the Supreme Court on elections. Like, now to turn towards pessimism, Bush v. Gore, an example of the Supreme Court overruling state courts for the worse. What's your take on that, fear of something like that happening, giving them essentially the last word when it comes to cases involving elections?
Well, I think it's somewhat inevitable. The Supreme Court was never really going to sit on the sidelines if there's another Bush v. Gore type dispute that the lower courts struggle to resolve. I think that the problem is not just is not whether they have this power necessarily, but how they use it. The problem that really stood out with what Chief Justice Roberts wrote was that he didn't seem to articulate any sort of standard, any sort of test, anything for lower courts to use to sort of guide how to do this. That hazy understanding is going to be ripe for future applications that may not be predictable. And of course, if you can't predict what the law is doing, it gives the impression that it's arbitrary.
Yeah, but then now I'm moving towards optimism again. Like the idea that the Supreme Court would satisfy leftist concerns over election integrity with a standard that we could all get behind, that seems like that was a bit of an unrealistic expectation. I mean, I think we've avoided the worst case scenario, which is allowing these state legislatures, which can contain crazy right-wing nut jobs, as we know, to have as much power over how elections are structured. I mean, this could, if they had endorsed this theory, as three of the justices seem to think would have been on the table for them, that would have opened up so many horrible outcomes potentially for election integrity in this country.
Absolutely right. And I think it's worth noting that this is a case that was involving partisan gerrymandering.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that Roberts has previously said the federal courts can't get involved in. He said that in a case in 2019. So now, if he had gone the other way on this, if the conservative justices had gone the other way on this, you would have a scenario where states could redraw these partisan maps that are highly favorable towards one party or the other, and in practice, it's usually the Republicans. And now federal courts couldn't review them, state courts couldn't review them, state constitutions wouldn't be able to affect them. In terms of dodged bullets, this was a huge one for the future of American democracy.
Well, happy to have some good news, because I'm not sure we will in the upcoming cases. But before we get to that, I also wanted to highlight, you've been writing about the Supreme Court and its approach towards tribal sovereignty. And oddly, Neil Gorsuch has a much more positive and productive interpretation of Native American case law and tribal sovereignty in this country versus, say, what Clarence Thomas has has delineated about what his approach is going to be in cases moving forward. But I guess let's just touch on that Navajo Nation case, the fallout from it, and where the fault lines or battle lines are being drawn, I should say, with respect to the conservative justices on tribal sovereignty.
Well, sure. I think that the Navajo Nation case really clarified a sort of enduring question that was circling the court over the last years, and that was, why is Gorsuch so passionate about these tribal law cases? He often sides with tribal sovereignty, but it's more than just that, right? He writes about it with great empathy. He writes about it very persistently, and it's something that clearly animates him. And I think what we've seen with the Navajo Nation case is that he's not just espousing this on his own. He's responding to something that he's seeing within the court, and that is sort of a move by some of the justices to disregard tribal sovereignty. And I think we see that in Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, where he sort of lays out how he thinks much of the Supreme Court's precedents on Native Americans should be overturned. That would have far-reaching implications for the tribes, and I think that Gorsuch's passionate defense of tribal sovereignty makes a little more sense in that context.
Yeah, and then in contrast with Thomas, Gorsuch being an outlier in this instance in a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court doesn't really help a ton of matters, because there's going to be a swing vote as well. But Clarence Thomas, as always, in the depths of being like the worst person of all time, clearly has a very different approach than what we've seen from Gorsuch.
Well, and I think that it really shows something about what originalism. We talk about originalism a lot. We talk about the court. We talk about how they read the Constitution. We're really seeing two different approaches to it here, and I think they're quite telling about themselves. Because when you read, Justice Gorsuch go through the history of Native American treatment in this country, the history of how tribes were moved and relocated, you see somebody who actually does appear to understand the original public meaning of what these provisions meant, how they fit into history. You contrast that with Justice Thomas, which very much starts from sort of a very narrow, constrained reading of the Constitution, and then just flows from there. It's a really striking difference in methodology that could have ramifications, obviously, for tribal sovereignty, but also speaks volumes about how they approach other cases.
Yeah, and what are some of the other cases that you feel? I know that they decided that they weren't going to overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act, but there could be more coming down the pipeline here. What's your sense of how this fight will play out in the coming years?
Well, the big question is what the other justices will do. We know what Gorsuch will do. We know what Thomas will do. Where do the rest of the court's conservative justices fall? And we've seen some signs that, there may be some wiggle room. Certainly with the Indian Child Welfare Act case, we saw Justice Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh join with Gorsuch on that one. And then, a week later, we saw them go the other direction in Navajo Nation. Whether or not those justices side with Gorsuch or Thomas in the long run will really decide the future of tribal sovereignty in this country for at least the next few decades.
Well, that's a scary proposition. Let's now talk about some of those upcoming cases, though, where the outcomes may not be as positive as they were in Moore v. Harper. We have the affirmative action case coming up, student debt, same-sex marriage in regards to that graphic designer person. But let's start with affirmative action here. These are two plaintiffs, right? Or two challenges to one, a private university, Harvard, and then UNC Chapel Hill, which is obviously a public one. But what the justices seem to be deciding between is overturning the precedent, which is Grutter in this case, if I'm not mistaken. It seems like they, based on oral arguments, are leaning towards doing so and essentially saying, hey, affirmative action's based on race for higher education. It's outlived its usefulness. We've solved racism in schools, and there you go. Is that your sense of how things are going to play out as well?
Well, the challenge with covering the Supreme Court is that it's always difficult to predict how opinions will actually come out. We've seen that in the last couple of weeks, certainly in the Voting Rights Act case. last week. So I would never guarantee that something will happen. But I will say that it would be a tremendous surprise if the court does not overturn Grutter, or at least does not sort of severely limit affirmative action in college admissions. This is a slate of justices who has strongly expressed views against that in the past. We have Justice Thomas, who has argued that it was unconstitutional all along, all the way since 1868. And we have, Justice Roberts, who has argued that, he's got that famous line, the only way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. These are justices who very strongly believe that the Constitution is colorblind in all aspects and that you cannot use race as any factor in policy decisions. And I think that what we should expect, barring some sort of very surprising behind-the-scenes development, is that that's how the opinion will play out. It's really just a question of how far they will go in terms of, limiting it to just college admissions, or whether they'll speak more broadly about other aspects of diversity programming in society.
Yeah, is there do between public and private schools in this instance? Do you sense that there will be a way in which they try to parse anything on those lines?
I mean, it's always possible. The challenge is that, if for those who would make that argument that, Harvard, while a private institution, does receive federal funds. And so part of a condition of receiving federal funds is abiding by, the constitutional restrictions on race discrimination.
Right.
So that would be harder for them it would be very hard to thread that needle if that's the route they wanted to go.
There you go. Thank you for clarifying that. I remember that was part of why these cases were able to kind of be brought together now. On student debt here, people are also pessimistic based on oral arguments. As you say, though, it's very hard to predict. They seem to be skeptical about the authority that Biden had in this instance, which I think is silly. But the part that should be the easiest to undercut is the lack of standing by the plaintiffs in these student debt cases. Like, what is the harm that's being alleged here? But it seems, based on them taking it up, that they feel that that standing is sufficient for them to make a decision in this instance.
Well, they could change their mind on that, though. We saw that in the Indian Child Welfare Act case, which we just discussed. Right. Where they took up the case and then decided that some of the plaintiffs, in fact, did not have standing. And, whether you want to read that as them looking at it more closely and thinking, we were wrong, or whether you want to read that as them thinking, we don't want to get into this right now. We'll just say no standing and move on. I think the challenge with the student debt one is that you have a very clear contrast between justices who are very strongly against it on policy grounds per se. You had Robertson Gorsuch saying that, what about the people who didn't pay student loans, which is sort of more of a political argument than a legal one. But, for the justices, standing is tricky. If you change the standings, the precedents for standing, you basically create more work for yourself, which is sort of a blunt way to put it. But, the justices are reluctant to tinker too much with arguing who can bring cases before the court. And, there are also questions about whether or not the Missouri state institution is supposedly being harmed by this is actually have legal standing to bring the case of its own, whether Missouri can speak on its behalf. This one's a lot harder to predict. I wouldn't be willing to guarantee that it goes any way or the other. And I think it comes down to really what the justices think about the procedural aspect and whether or not they think there might be another way to deal with this in the future.
And this graphic designer who is trying to challenge based on, I believe, it was religious objections that she didn't want to hypothetically make a website for a gay couple that could be getting married. This is, to me, it seems redundant with the cake case from a few years ago. But what is this case? How is it different? If you don't mind explaining that.
Well, with the cake case, we had a Colorado baker who declined a same-sex couple's request to bake a cake. There was a very clear fact pattern as to what went wrong. There was an injury. There was standing. This case is, like you said, a lot more hypothetical. You have a Christian web designer who thinks that Colorado will punish her if she refuses to design websites for same-sex couples. She does not currently design those websites. She has never designed those websites. And she only has her promise that she might do it in the future. That is pretty hypothetical, and that is pretty fraught ground to essentially ask for what could be a major change in First Amendment law before the court. But, this is a case involving religious freedom, and we know statistically that scholars have studied this, that the Roberts Court is more likely to rule in favor of plaintiffs who bring religious liberty claims than any court in the last 100 years. So whenever that happens, we have to wonder, is this a case where, the Supreme Court will actually look at it and say, well, procedurally, this might not be up to snuff. Maybe we shouldn't go this far on this front. Or maybe they'll look at it and say, you know what, this is an issue of grave importance to Americans' religious consciousness, and we should go full steam ahead.
Yeah. Clearly, there seems to be some understanding from the right-wing groups that are backing these efforts that they feel they'll have a more sympathetic ear, all the way back to Dobbs, which I think yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And we now do have a preview of some of the things that after this term ends in a few days, what the Supreme Court is going to be starting to take up next year. You wrote about this in the New Republic. The fact that they have decided that they're going to take up a case that could prevent Congress from passing a wealth tax. What is this case? Who are the plaintiffs? How is this even possible? They're preempting a potential wealth tax?
Well, that's if you believe the plaintiffs, that's what they think the court can do in this case. This is a case that in the meat and potatoes is actually about the Trump tax cuts that were passed a few years ago. There was a provision in there that was being challenged. It involved a one-time repatriation tax. It's mind-numbing for anyone who's not a tax lawyer. But that's the basic gist of it, is whether or not Congress can levy that tax under the Constitution, under the 16th Amendment, or whether they have to do it under a different mechanism that's more complicated. Now, that dispute in of itself is interesting, but not really significant. What sets this one apart is that the plaintiffs and their lawyers explicitly push this case as a way to say, hey, the reasoning that you could use to strike this down could also be used against federal wealth taxes in the future. And we know that when Democrats, especially Elizabeth Warren, especially Ron Wyden, have pushed for these in recent years, there's been a lot of pushback from the conservative legal movement saying that they aren't constitutional. And so this is a way to sort of preempt that and get it before the justices before Democrats even have a chance to pass it. That's not my supposition. That's what the plaintiffs and their lawyers have actually said.
They are scared. It's funny to see in a way, but it's like, this could not be more clearly within the jurisdiction as laid out by the Constitution of what Congress is supposed to be engaged in. The power of the purse, right? Like, this is exactly what Congress's role is in terms of the congressional or the constitutional delineation of their duties, is it not?
Well, the plaintiffs argue, to their fairness, that the 16th Amendment only allows income taxes to be levied without apportioning it among the states. You have to basically adjust it by population for each state. But if you do the income tax, you can just levy an income tax on everyone. Now, the proponents of the wealth tax say, look, this is basically an income tax because, with wealth, you can borrow against it, you can take out lines of credit based on it, you can derive income from it even if it's not direct. They say, no, hold on. We want this to be read narrowly. We want income tax to be read narrowly so that you can't do this because otherwise it would violate the Constitution. And so how the justices come down on that could be decisive in whether or not Congress can do this without jumping through a lot of very difficult hoops in the future.
Honestly, there needs to be some sort of leftist or liberal mechanism that can do this kind of thing. Like say, God forbid, there's a Republican Congress and a president agrees that, hey, let's start to privatize Social Security and Medicare. I would love for a leftist group to bring a case based on similar grounds just because, hey, I don't agree with this and the Supreme Court should strike it down, because that's essentially what they're doing. They're circumventing democratic process that hasn't even happened yet and trying to put a chilling effect on it via unelected priests, the Supreme Court.
I mean, I think that the Supreme Court, this case won't be heard until the fall. It won't be decided until probably next summer. The Supreme Court has gone through a lot in the last couple of years. It's gone through a severe decline, a very measurable decline in its public esteem. And I think that may weigh on the justices. Now, whether that will weigh enough on them to say, hey, this isn't as big of a case as it needs to be, that'll be down the road. But I think the more that people perceive the Supreme Court to be acting in ways that are inimical to democracy, that are partisan, that are political, the more likely it is that there will be a backlash. And I think the justices, if they want to retain the prestige and power that the institution enjoys, they have to be conscious of that, because if not, Congress will take action.
It really is incredible how, Elizabeth Warren has a special place in, triggering certain legal conservative minds, whether it's the CFPB. They've been trying to attack that for years at this point, and they're successful in ways of bleeding it dry. Whether it be the wealth tax, just the threat of what she's been proposing, it's amazing to me. Yeah, there's a reason. I mean, you hear about how she's so despised on Wall Street for that kind of stuff.
If memory serves, and this is going a bit off of memory, I think there is even another CFPB case coming up next term. So, in a way, to make a bad pun, it really is the return of the Warren Court.
Well said. Well said. I mean, we can only go down from there, Matt. So I'll let you go because that was a perfect way to end it. Matt Ford of the New Republic. You can read his coverage, all his work about a variety of things, about covering the Supreme Court as well. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. It was a joy. Appreciate it. All right, guys, with that, we're going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half. The number is 646-257-3920. Guys, we need your support more than ever. Join themajorityreport.com. Please support this program. There's some weirdness with YouTube ads.
There was a concerning piece in the Wall Street Journal last night that said something like 80% of ads that YouTube serves off-site, I believe. I don't subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, so I got paywall, but don't meet their standards, and the people might be entitled to a refund. So I'll just say we take a good chunk of money from YouTube to keep the lights on here. So become a member at jointhemajorityreporters.com.
Please do. We don't have Rumble backing or anything like that.
We might have to start being nice about Saks and Calacanis and all those freaks pretty soon.
I gotta tone all of that down in order to get some money. So, guys, please become a member if you can. We're going to take calls in the fun half again. The number is 646-257-3920. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning, we had a good talk last night with journalist Yasha Levine about Russia. We also talked about, what did we talk about in the post game? The Reddit moderator strike and how the Reddit CEO basically wants to IPO, and he's like, how do I do this the best? I'll do what Elon Musk is doing and just fire people and destroy the community for, in his case, an prospective IPO in the future. So patreon.com/leftreckoning to hear that.
And on ESPN, Bradley and I did way too early over-unders for the 32 NFL teams, which got us pretty hyped, pretty fun. We also spoke about the NHL banning pride jerseys because they're cowards and pathetic. And we spoke about all the recent NBA trades. YouTube.com/ESPN show for that. All right, guys, heading into the fun half. We will see you there, and we'll do one Tim Pool clip from the interview. That's the tease. Become a member so you can have access to the fun half whenever you want. All right. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it. All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half. Oh, no. Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Can we bring back DJ Danner?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males...
Psych. Fuck them. Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on, fuck them. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy.
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We are back. It is the fun half, everybody. To read some IMs. Noble Villain, Emma, I heard that the NBA and the Washington Wizards snuck a news story about their team getting partially purchased by a Qatari fund that was also a part of the FIFA disaster last year. I hadn't heard about it until today. Figured it was worth sharing and getting more context. I saw that. I think I saw it after we did ESPN, but this is going to be happening more and more. And it wasn't just the Wizards, right? It was another team that I can't think of off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, Washington sports in a really, really tough spot right now. Although thankfully Snyder's finally selling. But
I listened to Austin Reeves' podcast on the Ringer. He's a point guard, played for the Timberwolves last year, and they were talking about the Phil Mickelson, the live thing. And his buddy, like a personal friend, is also his co-host, and asked him, like, do you see NBA players doing this? He said, absolutely, and very soon.
They are going to come for different sports soon.
There's a new collective bargaining agreement in the NBA that is going to be very. I mean, and it's sort of like, to me, with my ideology, it's like we need to either S or get off the pot with who gets to own these things. We already had the situation where Phoenix Suns, a franchise, that has the value because of all, like, Charles Barkley, Dan Marley in the 90s, Steve Nash, Amar Stoudemire, Shawn Marion in the 2000s, recently Devin Booker, Chris Paul, like those guys, those players built that into a multi-billion-dollar organization that the racist who owned it was able to sell.
Yeah, and make a massive profit. I mean,
and
Michael Jordan just sold the Charlotte Hornets, but he bought it for hundreds of millions and then just sold it for billions. And whatever. Jordan's like the least problematic owner possible.
Well, he should be able to. Like, every player should have a ownership stake in these. And I don't know how you structure this. I'm not like a labor expert or a co-op expert or whatever like this. But I do know that the situation where the dumb son of the racist son's owner shouldn't be benefiting with generational wealth based on stuff that was created by athletes.
I mean, the owners are completely not necessary, but they are vanity projects for billionaires. Like, we could have, in theory, what the Green Bay Packers have, where it's collective ownership, not by the players, but it's a structure where it's
municipal.
It's municipal, and there is like a CEO of the team, essentially, as opposed to having one guy who just happens to have enough capital to purchase a team. And like, we're seeing it right now with the Oakland A's. These billionaires will hold communities hostage if they don't get their way, and then if they don't get the tax giveaway that they want, they'll go to a different location.
Yeah, and like, billionaires are so important to this process because the entire structure of America has decided that rich guys are going to be vital to do anything. And there's only a very brief period of time captured in the New Deal by an interesting book called Lords of Creation, where the state actually said, hey, actually capitalists can't do this. They can't set up an economy for war, for instance. They can't even electrify rural areas. Capitalism can only ultimately extract, or in certain cases, like, expand something into a consumer product.
Yes.
But this idea that it can actually build out, like, and meet the needs of a society is proven over and over again, both theoretically, Karl Marx, and in history by the American project, as just not feasible.
And it's such a threat, like, because these billionaires write these laws. The Packers are one of the oldest organizations in football. It's literally in NFL's bylaws that they can never have a structure like that ever again.
Yep.
That you need a billionaire to come in, because for them, you know, they don't want the players to be empowered in the way that they are, even though it's clearly obvious that everything about a team comes from the value of its players. And this is how labor, honestly, sports in this model is a really helpful way to view labor politics more broadly, because it's just so direct in this situation.
Yeah, and I also like hate how instead of like ownership, they're empowered as like capitalists. So what are they given now that the players are excited about is the ability to invest their own money that they already earned from wages from capitalists that owns the teams into, say, the WNBA, which they weren't allowed to even do before.
Right.
And which is just like, okay, you know, we'll let you do a little bit more, but it is empowered not as you as like the laborer who built this entire thing and upon whose like shoulders this rests, but as one of us in a sort of way. And the other thing is with like the college athletes thing, where we're not going to give you any sort of like wage or ownership over what you're building for these universities, which goes to like head coaches' major salaries. But you can sell yourself to another capitalist by marketing their product in commercials.
Exactly. That's why NIL is I will take any opportunity for the players to actually make money, 100%. But it is totally insufficient. They need to be getting wages. The amount of value that these athletes are providing for their university is insane, and they should be compensated commensurate to what they're providing. Like, if you can work at the college bookstore and make a wage, you can be a laborer as an athlete on the team and get paid sufficiently. So, Floyd the Barber NBA teams in Milwaukee